All right, welcome on everybody to our first live YouTube stream in a while. Of course, the public Dunked On pod as well, and this and every single one of our endeavors is available ad-free on Dunked On Prime. And a reminder for those of you who are not Dunked On Prime subscribers, up until the start of the season, got about a day or so to get this. We are offering 35% off a year membership. That is our best deal ever, using the code preseason24 at Dunked On Prime. Link to that, of course, is in the show notes. So we've had a bunch of rookie extensions that happened today. We will get to those at a slightly later point. There might still be some coming in, so we want to do all those at once. Instead, though, we have to do our massive season prediction podcast, Mr. LaRue. Where would you like to start?
Well, I think we should start at something that you've already done a lot of legwork on, but I'll kind of catch up in a different way, which is ranking the conferences 1 to 15. And so you've done win predictions in your excellent podcast with your team-specific guests. And so you've kind of done that. So but it also, like, you have the ability to modify those if you want. So I don't do win predictions for every team, because when you don't do the pods like you do, I think that's that granular, but I do have my teams ordered. So you can pick West or East, but I think that's where we start.
Yeah, let's start at the one true conference, the Western Conference.
Okay, do you want to? How much of yours do you want to run? Do you want to run through 1 to 15?
Yeah, I'll run through every one. I think you can kind of, if we have a big difference of opinion, I think we should talk about it.
Absolutely.
I've got the OKC Thunder being the 1 seed. The news that Isaiah Hartenstein is out to start the year, and also Jalen Williams still has this hamstring injury. The big Jalen Williams leaves them a little bit thinner in the front court than they might like. Kenrich Williams is also out, so they really don't have any kind of established backup center available to start the year right now. So I bumped them down from 58 to 56 wins. I still think their defense is going to be really, really good, but maybe not like number one in the league type of level necessarily, at least until Hartenstein gets back. And I am a little worried about their offense. I think they are more susceptible to an injury to Shea or Jalen Williams than some people might be rating. But I still think 56 wins is pretty good. And certainly this is a group that I think probably has a little more upside on that number than downside if they do get everything clicking, or perhaps if they make a trade.
We are in agreement there. I have the Thunder number 1 on my board as well. And yeah, it is disheartening that Hartenstein's going to miss part of the season and the backup big issues, but
disheartening, eh?
Yeah. And so I think that that does, you could say weaken their projection or anything like that, but their foundation offensively and defensively is still very strong. And I don't have the same concerns about them that I do some of the other, albeit great teams in the West.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were top 5 offense and defense last year. I think they'll be better on defense, but actually worse on offense this year. I'm also interested to see how Shea does with the new foul drawing regime.
Yeah.
Number 2 in the West for me is actually the Denver Nuggets with 54 wins. Now,
same
that's
for
one
me.
I can. Yeah, okay. I considered lowering that a little bit, particularly with Jamal Murray not exactly building on his atrocious summer and series against Minnesota, but I'm hopeful that will come along. And in Jokic, we trust. I still, he's gotten, I think the league is better now, but he's gotten groups that had no Murray and no Porter to almost 50 wins. And he has no track record whatsoever of getting hurt. Like, he's just that good of a player. And I do think that while there isn't one specific guy in their bench that I'm just like overwhelmingly high on, I think they have enough outs there through guys like Peyton Watson, Julian Strawther. I think even Westbrook will give them more at backup point guard than they've had in the past. Even with the loss of KCP, I actually think that their bench won't be quite as horrible as it's been in the past. I do think they at least have a little bit more of a theory. I think they can be decent on defense on their bench. So I do still that Jokic floor. I mean, this is a team that won 57 a year ago, and I'm not sure exactly what the reason is. I think they're going to be like so much worse in the regular season this year.
Exactly. And I have concerns about the Nuggets, but those are mostly postseason concerns rather than regular season. As long as Jokic stays healthy, they have a lot of other capable defenders. They can make this work. And so I think that, and my next kind of this group was kind of the Nuggets versus the Mavs versus the Wolves. Like that's kind of where I
Yeah.
had things. And I trust the Nuggets the most. Now, does that mean they're definitely going to finish better? No, not necessarily. But I think that when you compare them to Dallas, like I think that Dallas, the level they played at after the trades is firmly in this conversation. And if I trusted Luka to stay as healthy as Jokic has basically been every season, then I probably would have them second. But Luka doesn't have that same history. It seems like he always misses like 15 games, maybe 20 games in a year due to various things. He already had this calf issue in the preseason. So even though they have more playmaking depth now with Spencer Dinwiddie available, it's still not quite the same thing. And I'm intrigued by how their support players are going to look, bringing Klay Thompson in, bringing Najee Marshall in, losing Derek Jones Jr. But I'm more sure, even without KCP, of the Nuggets than I am. So I went Nuggets, Mavs, Wolves, but Mavericks and Wolves are very close. And I can explain briefly why I did that is because Mavericks over Wolves. My theory of Minnesota is that their defense is still going to be great, but they were so ludicrously great last year that even if they take like a 2 points per 100 possession gap, and it might be more than that, then that just makes it so much harder because I don't think their offense is going to be, like markedly better. So if they go from like historically great to great, then that's a hit. And the top of the West is strong enough that I had the Mavericks over them.
Yeah, and I have a top tier of defenses of OKC, Minnesota, and Boston. I might say Minnesota with the injuries in the front court for OKC, it maybe could still be the number one group. But yeah, I think, they're not going to be 3 points per 100 better than the whole league this year. Like that's just not going to happen, in part because I think OKC is going to be really good. So I do think the Minnesota's going to be better on offense this year, though. I think they're going to shoot more threes than they did a year ago. I think DiVincenzo is really going to help. I don't think that Randall is that much of a downgrade from Towns offensively, even if they do it in somewhat different ways. And I think just they're going to run more. I think Edwards can be a little bit better, although he might come up later. So yeah, I had Minnesota with 53 wins, Dallas with 52. But I honestly think that any of those top four in the West, I mean, 3 of those top 4 in the West to me got better in the offseason. And I don't know how much Denver took a step back, at least as a regular season team. Although, of course, if Murray is just going to continue to be a total disaster, then maybe that changes. I also have the Phoenix Suns at 51 wins. I view them as more another tier down, particularly as a postseason team. But in Bud, I trust. They are shooting more threes. I think they just generally have. I actually don't think that the combination of Booker, Beal, and KD are going to be any better than they were a year ago. You'd be, I think, asking for more than 45 games for that trio all playing together is probably asking a lot. But they just have so many more real NBA players, and I think they have better coaching this year that like they're just not going to have these atrocious moments where they're the worst fourth quarter team in history and like turning it over constantly. They really fixed those issues with Morris and Jones. So I think just this is a group where the math in a number of ways, whether it's shooting threes offensively, whether it's not sucking on the bench, is just going to work out better for them than it did a year ago with basically the same group at the top.
I have the Suns in this group, but I have another team among them. You brought up in Bud We Trust, and it's a Bud disciple in Taylor Jenkins and the Grizzlies, where I'm more scared of Ja Morant's injury stuff than I am any of the players on the Suns, but I believe in their foundation. I believe that this is a team that will be strong defensively, that when Ja plays, and they will miss Steven Adams more than I think some are projecting. Like, this is not the same Grizzlies team that we saw the last time Ja was healthy, but they're still damn good. And so for me, it's kind of those two teams. I think they have more upside than their brethren, but I also think if they stay remotely healthy, I think they have less downside too. Like, there are a bunch of other good teams in the West, but these ones I just have more confidence overall.
Do you think could trade David Roddy to get D'Anthony Melton back? Would that? I obviously.
Well, but they couldn't pay Melton and Luke Kennard, so you got to keep Luke Kennard.
Yeah, yo, that's right. Yeah, I mean that was another. You make a great point there. I do think though this Memphis bench is just not what it was, and they just feel really snake bit. There are a lot of big injury risk guys here. Jaron Jackson Jr. is already going to miss the start of the season after everyone declared that he was going to be ready. He hasn't played at all in camp. I think this Grizzlies over is very much reliant on him getting back to defending at the level that he showed 2 years ago. He wasn't close to that level last year. Can he be better, freed up more with Brandon Clark and Zach Edey next to him? Maybe, but this isn't off to a great start there.
Yeah, I think
Also,
you've convinced me to move the Suns over the Grizz. Like
okay.
Jaron's injury, and I
Well,
as I
and
was
Vince
talking
Williams
about,
Jr. being out, like
yeah,
GG Jackson being out, like they're pretty thin. I think if they were healthy, they would look a lot better, but they're pretty thin to me.
yeah, and also another team we've talked about this before, where when they're shorthanded, they have to lean a little bit more on guys that I'm not fully there. I like Brandon Clark and Santi Aldama, and hopefully they'll be a little bit less. But the key foundational stuff, and we'll talk about him later on. But like, I am really not sure what they're going to get from Marcus Smart this year.
Yeah, I actually had the Grizz with the 7th seed with 47 wins. New Orleans, actually, I had at 48. I was somewhat cowed with my optimism on them due to my discussion with Will Guillory, because not only do they not have any centers, but they only really have one power forward on the roster too, which is Zion.
Who has lots of injury stuff. Yeah, that was a part of
Yeah.
why I had them below the Grizz.
And then they have good players coming off their bench, but a lot of them are small. And I think that Najee Marshall, who they just let go purely for financial reasons, they could have re-signed him legally. And then Dyson Daniels was part of the Murray trade. I do think Murray will help them a little bit, but it sounds like they're going to be starting CJ McCollum still. So I think they might finally reach a tipping point with this Willie Green defense where they're not able to be as good as they've been in the past. I think they could be an offensive monster. Zion looks great. All the things you're hearing about him are very solid. Again, I recommend listening to that pod with Will Guillory. He had a lot of really good observations about this group, but I'm worried that their defensive house of cards may finally fall. But I think their offense could be really good. Like, I think this group does have some pretty good upside, and particularly if they could just shore up a little bit in their rotation or at center. Sacramento, I have with 46 wins. I actually think that group has a little bit of upside. I know they didn't win games in this preseason, but I thought they had moments where they looked good. DeRozan looks really good to me. They have a lot of depth in the backcourt. Maybe some of that gets swapped out to get a little bit more athleticism in the front court. But I think they're just going to be a very solid offense, and we'll see the defense. Can they maintain the improvement from last year, or does bringing in DeRozan mean that they're going to take another step back? But I have them for 46 wins, same as Golden State. So that's the 8th seed to the 9th seed. Golden State, I think, does have a lot of downside risk. If anything happens to Seth Curry, their offense is going to immediately be terrible, and he's just not what he was a couple of years ago. Any comments on those two teams?
I have those two and two more kind of in a tier together. I have the Warriors over the Kings, but I have a team between them, and that is another Pacific Division team, the Lakers. I am a little bit spooked by how reliant they are on their best guys and their best guys being older and everything else, but they do still have a fair amount of high level talent. So I think the Lakers are going to be better than the Kings this year, just because I think they have capable foundations on both ends of the floor in a way that I'm really worried about Sacramento's defense.
I'm very worried about the Laker defense, obviously, and they have one good defensive player that you really can count on. Or you kind of get to these Vanderbilts, Gabe Vincent. I think if he plays well for them, that could go a long way to boosting their projection. And then, of course, there's the fact that they were lucky to win 47 games statistically last year, and LeBron and AD basically played the whole year. Both those guys are on the downside. Even if they do play as much, I don't expect them to be quite as good as they were last year. And it gets late early when you start getting into this bench with the unproven guys that they're relying on. They just have so many completely dead roster spots right now due to the Rob Pelinka player option parade. And they're just, guys like Vanderbilt, who I just think is like never going to be healthy. They're relying on Christian Wood. Like anytime AD is off the floor, their defense is going to be kind of worse in the league levels. So I think there isn't enough of a foundation under LeBron and AD, even like that starting lineup that supposedly was good, 23-10 last year. Like, I don't know how they stop anybody, and I don't see this as, being like a top 5 offensive group. So I actually have them for 43 wins, right around the 10th seed. Of course, they owe their picks to the Atlanta Hawks, originally New Orleans from the AD trade, the deferral pick.
Stray note: Rob Plinka's player option parade, not a bad band name. Very niche.
Yeah.
Okay, so the biggest team we haven't talked about, I mentioned there was another team this tier, is Houston. And I'm sure there'd be some, like Houston had the differential of a 46-win team last year. And we talked about this a little bit in the Over-Unders podcast. But would be surprised that, and I have them in this tier personally too. Like, I have them in this group. But what leads you to be a little less confident in them than you are everyone else?
I think it's just going to be a weird year. I think there's just a lot to figure out. They have pretty good depth, but they're still not a great shooting team. How is Reed Shepherd going to get mixed in? You just kind of have a lot of mouths to feed, although I do think this Jalen Green extension, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is a fascinating one that might at least quell some of the issues they have, but doesn't look like Şengün's going to get an extension. And he's probably looking for around the max. I mean, they have a lot of talent on this team, but I think they're just finding the lineups that work, figuring out which of these young guys really can play and which ones can't. They're working in Steven Adams as a backup center as well. It just seems like it's going to be a season of some growing pains. And as much as you like their depth and their defense, Şengün, at least where he is right now, as your best player, is, that's probably not, necessarily screaming above 500. They were very lucky defensively in terms of opponent missed shots last year. So that's something that could stare. It just doesn't, emotionally, it just doesn't seem like a team that has it all figured out yet. And I still haven't done their outlook yet. Hopefully that's coming later today, but so maybe I'll feel differently after I really dig into them. But I think they're not quite at the level of these other teams, but certainly, I could see this team even getting up into the high 40s potentially. I wonder how good they can be on offense. I just don't see how you get top half of the league in offense, and then you really rely on the defense.
The other important thing to note with the Rockets, and I know Matt Moore and others have talked about this as well, is they won a lot of games when other teams weren't trying, and sometimes the sample there can be a little bit interesting. And so, are they how much of that, and with some unusual configurations? And Ime Udoka is a great coach, so he kind of pushes back in the other direction. But again, this is a strong group, and I believe that all of these teams could win a fair amount of games. I am less confident in the four.
Well, this is the thing I'm most excited to talk about in this whole preview, is that my next team is the Clippers, and Houston and the Clippers are pretty close to each other in my projections.
Oh yeah, you're justified obsession. I mean, this is a flagging. Nate and I have been talking about this offline for roughly 2.5 weeks now, of the swap rights that Oklahoma City has, where basically these teams could try to outwin each other to try to not get swapped, is fascinating.
Oh wait, Şengün just got extended, the comments tell us.
Yeah, 5-185.
5 for 185. Wow. Okay. All right. I'm gonna just.
We're talking about that later. We're talking about that later.
Right now. All right. Got it. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. So basically the Thunder can swap with either Houston or the Clippers, and presumably would swap with whoever is worse this year. So those two teams are racing with each other to not get swapped with the Thunder, who, are probably going to be the 29th pick or something like that. But there's always the possibility the Thunder just be no, we're just going to swap with, we're going to swap with the Clippers, just so that, because we have all their draft picks in the future, just to screw them over even worse.
If they're one apart in its late lottery, it wouldn't, it would be cold and calculating, but I think it'd be smart.
Yeah, and the Clippers, this is a team that if they had their pick, I would be picking them for just utter disaster potential, just with the Kawhi situation, which we talked about pretty extensively yesterday. And, I could see them even so just selling off some pieces. Even getting them to 37 wins is kind of a trust in Ty Lue to get something out of this team like he did back in 2022.
I have the Clippers at the 12th spot, I believe, as well as you do. And then the last three, San Antonio, I have them at 13. I think some are like we talked about this in the over under. I think some are overly confident in them. Just I think they'll be a better version of a similar team. They haven't figured out a lot of their issues as exciting as Victor Wembanyama is, and I think Chris Paul will help, but they'll do that. And then the Jazz and the Blazers are the final two. And what's bizarre about it is I think that in many ways the Blazers like have a better roster right now, but it doesn't really fit together. You brought up like the kind of like snake bit part of it with Memphis. Like it feels like the Blazers are they're already having dealing with some significant injuries. They have players that aren't completely congruous and they should be making trades. So I ended up going Jazz 14, Blazers 15, but it wouldn't surprise me if as I interpreted you saying it, if the Danny Ainge bought Lowry Markkanen's complicity in it, and this, so they end up trying to out tank the Blazers. But I think the Blazers will just be worse.
Yeah, I think that's right. And for the Spurs, I only have them with 31 wins. I think this team around Victor Wembanyama is so bad. They don't have anything else approaching an above average starter on this team to me, unless you want to call Vassell that, but he's hurt to start the year. Their shooting is going to be atrocious. I think they'll have a pretty good defense when Wembanyama is on the floor, but every other aspect of their team is not going to be very good. So, so 13 San Antonio, Utah 26 wins, Portland I've got with 23. And let's move. Well, here let's talk about how we see the West playing out in the playoffs.
Because we don't know exactly what the bracket's going to be, I'm not going to get too much into the styles makes fights minutia.
So, I feel like that is just so the case among that top four in the West.
Exactly.
Right
like I have it, Denver being 2 and Wolves being 4. Well, that would probably work out well for Denver because Minnesota beat them last year. But I think so. The way I do this, it actually kind of ties in with our crystal ball stuff, where it's the most likely conference finalist and the most likely conference winner. And so I went Thunder over Nuggets.
Yeah, I couldn't quite get there. I actually have Denver as my most likely team to win the conference, just because I think Nikola Jokic is that good, and hopefully they'll get more. As much as you're concerned about Murray, I would hope that he could give them more than he did in last year's playoffs, at least.
He's going to have to give them a lot more than last year's playoffs for them to beat 4 teams, or 3 series.
Yeah, I just don't think OKC is a good enough offense right now, but of course that could very much change with the assets they have available. They have matching salary available. I think they need one more creator and one more 3-and-D type of player. Maybe they can find that in the same package, which would be amazing. That would be a pretty big trade. I still think they should be very aggressive with that. Obviously, they did a great job of acquiring players that basically didn't denude their roster in any way with using cap space on Hartenstein, and then Giddey, who wasn't really a major part of their plans going forward anyway, to get Caruso for him. So yeah, I see. Yeah, I don't know. I said Denver, and then I looked down. I was like, no, actually, I have OKC versus Dallas written down here, and I have Dallas making the finals. So it's I think any of those teams. I mean, my power rankings would have the Wolves last as a playoff team among those 4. But again, it really is about matchups. I think the Wolves could match up pretty well against OKC with their rim protection. Dallas just beat OKC. I think Dallas got better this year. Their shooting problems could be alleviated with some of the additions that they made. So this really is a total shit show between those 4. So I really go back and forth. I guess I thought about it more earlier. So I guess I'll go OKC. Having them in that is maybe more based on the fact that they could make a trade. And they will have probably the deepest group of any of these,
and they'll probably have home court advantage. I think that they'll.
That could matter too. But I even think any of those 4 teams could have home court too. Maybe Denver's the least likely of those. Although my theory with Denver is that they're just going to have to push harder than they want to in the regular season, and that's why they're actually going to win more games than some people are expecting. So yeah, I guess I have Dallas winning the conference, but I'm like, they have a 26% chance, and Denver has a 24% chance. It's really, I guess I'm going to go with Dallas. I think probably my biggest reason for that is I actually think that Luka Doncic is going to have a much better playoffs this year than he did last year. Like, he usually has been awesome in the playoffs, and after he hurt the knee, just was kind of a Steph Curry in 2016 kind of situation where he was good some nights, not good other nights. And so I think he actually could get to the point where, like he and Jokic, and then can Shea get to that level? Like, I'm not sure he's quite the same offensive force. He does a lot on defense, of course, too. But I think with the lack of spacing for OKC, that Shea might have a pretty heavy lift in the way that Luka doesn't. I think Luka is going to have easily the best group around him that he's ever had, and he's that good.
Speaking of things that are hard to parse, the top of the East outside of, for me, the Celtics at number 1 is brutal, in part because, especially after the Max Strus injury, I don't really have faith in any of those other teams as a regular season team. Honestly, probably as a postseason team relative to expectations. But I mean, so do you have the Celtics, first of all, before we get into that, do you have the Celtics 1?
I do. Only 57 wins for them, though, which was under. It seems like, yes, they seem very determined, but no Porzingis for the first half of the year. I think the center thing could be a little bit of a problem. I think they're just going to chill a little bit, and in terms of resting guys. Although they did that to an underrated degree last year, but it's also, I just don't think they're going to be pushed that hard. I would have had Cleveland as number 2 at 52 wins. I dropped him down a win with the Strus news. Maybe I should be dropping him even more. But to give you an idea of how tight I think this is, I've got Cleveland, Philly, New York, and Milwaukee all at 51 wins, although varying degrees of certainty and error bars are on each of those.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I was getting at with it. So I have a tier that is those 4 teams. I ended up with the Bucks, then the Cavs, then the Knicks, then the Sixers. The Chris Middleton news freaks me out enough that I almost moved them down, but I'm like, well, I'm not going to put the Cavs second. So it's just everything else happens.
Yeah. And Chris Middleton not going to start the season, apparently.
Yeah,
and it does even sound, maybe from parsing out Doc Rivers. I mean, Eric named trying to figure out in the preseason, like what the story is with Chris Middleton's injuries as one of my favorite subplots every year. But, it seems like maybe Chris was like trying to ramp up, and then maybe got some swelling again. And like, he's doing like contact 3-on-3, and now it's like he didn't practice. So, I don't know how long it's going to be for him with Mr. Kawhi East. Yeah, I mean, I think the Bucks have maybe the highest variance of those teams. I think Cleveland has maybe the lowest variance. But I think of all those teams, I probably, like, if we're just going to say who's healthy and has the highest ceiling to those groups, I probably like Philly the most.
Yeah, it's reasonable.
And the Knicks, they're just really thin too. I think their starting lineup is good, but they are relying on some guys who don't have the greatest health records, and they've got injuries already at the start of the year too.
Yeah, I think I'm moving Philly over. I'm moving Philly over the Knicks. Because I do believe in the full strength Sixers, and I think they'll be better non-Embiid this year than they were in prior years. But
yeah,
it is still, I mean, it's the elephant in all rooms is Joel Embiid's health.
Then I have a drop to Indiana at 47 wins. I certainly think that either they or Orlando could get into this mix. And in fact, I would be very surprised if one of Indiana or Orlando weren't a top 5 seed. But Indiana 47, Orlando 46. I'm not sure how much of a step forward the offense can take. And I don't know that this is like my number 2 defense all year, the way that they were a season ago.
I have one other team in this mix, and that's the Miami Heat. And Miami had this bizarre 46-win season last year, and there are some indicators that they can, like if Jimmy Butler has a better 24-25 than he did 23-24, that they could be there. But I don't necessarily love their upside potential. So I went Pacers, Heat, Magic, just because I think that the Magic's growth on offense, if it happens, which I'm skeptical of, that might take more time. Like, you talked about growing pains with the Rockets. It wouldn't surprise me if Magic have them too.
Yeah, I think Indiana, to me, probably has the best case of those 3 to really surprise, because I think the scenario is just the most obvious to me, right? Like you get the Tyrese Halliburton from the first half of last year. That's something that we've already seen him do. And then their defense is passable, which with their personnel, they should be possible. So like, if those two things happen, they're a 50-win team easily. Then you got the big drop off to the 9th seeded Atlanta Hawks at 37. Pretty interesting that I only have 2 teams projected to win between 42 and 32 wins, which is Atlanta at 37 and the Clippers at 37. I think it's telling that neither of those teams has their pick.
It is.
That is part of that analysis. You would think some other teams have to end up in that range, but that hasn't necessarily been the case. Hollinger predicted that we will see a 50-loss play-in team for the first time. That could easily be the Toronto Raptors. I have them. I actually am predicting that. I dropped them down a win with some uncertainty about RJ Barrett and just kind of thinking about how thin they are. But I still have them in the 10th seed by 5 games over Charlotte at 27. Then you got the Bulls 26, Detroit. This will interest you, Danny, on the over-under pod. I picked their over. I think it was 25.5. I have now changed that after seeing them in person in the preseason. I have them at 24. Brooklyn 22 and Washington 22 wins. I would say I'd probably give Brooklyn a better chance than Washington of being a better team.
I'll breeze through it, but I had Toronto 10, Charlotte 11, Bulls 12, Pistons 13, Wizards 14, Nets 15. But I should move the Nets over the Wizards because the Nets are actually much better than the Wizards right now. And while I think they have all the organizational motivation in the world because of what Sean Marks did, which is justified in every way, they haven't actually done it yet. And so I think the Wizards are bad now, and the Nets might take time to catch them. And it's very hard to catch a team that starts out where the Wizards are.
All right, our next topic
is
here.
the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yes. So
God,
I'm going to go Boston versus Philly there. Again, I've never been none of these teams really are teams that I'm like a massive believer in, either due to health or playoff track record. Yeah, I just think that Philly, I don't think that Karl Anthony Towns is going to like cause a bunch of problems for Philly. I think he would cause maybe more problems for the Bucks. I do still think maybe the Bucks upside is being slept on this season, just because I think Dame could have a bounce back. There's a whole slew of players, which we'll get to, where it seems like everyone has just like decided that these guys are done or that they suck. And like, I think Dame is kind of one of those players. I do think he's going to be better this year than he was a year ago, even though he is older, because everything was kind of working against him from a personal perspective. And I think he's pretty determined to kind of give it one last go. So, and obviously Giannis being hurt as well. Like I think the Bucks would have made the East Finals last year if they had just been healthy. So I think Philly and New York have gotten better, but that also like there's I think the Bucks can be right in that mix if everything breaks right for them.
I went Celtics over Bucks. I think that Cleveland has the lowest.
Oh, so you've got the Bucks making the conference finals, huh?
I think so. I think of that foursome, the Cavs have the lowest finals equity because I just think their flaws are bigger in the postseason than the regular season. Talked about it at length before. Then, and the Knicks, they're so shorthand. Like they need to be so healthy. I don't think they have that much of a capacity to make a ton of moves. They've traded a bunch of picks. They have all these other issues. So I think then it becomes between the Bucks and the Sixers. And what it came down to for me was if I have to place a bet that Joel Embiid is going to be healthy for 3 rounds of the playoffs, I am not going to place that bet. I would rather pick Milwaukee.
Yeah, well, then Giannis hasn't been healthy. Dame, Chris Middleton. I mean, there
are plenty of bad bets on this board. That is just the one that I'm going to make.
Right. No, that's exactly the point that I was going to make there. So, and then kind of lowest tier. So I guess who's your NBA champion? Boston?
Boston Celtics.
Yeah. I would say I would favor Boston over any team in the West. I'd want to see how they matched up with OKC, and then maybe Denver. Denver, I thought, really seemed to match up against them very well in 2 regular season games in which both teams were trying pretty hard last year. Like, I do think Jokic is one of the few guys that can really break Boston's defense and like force them to have to double team more, and then Jokic will pick that apart. So
yeah, and Boston doesn't have they don't have the kind of like second guy that would role that Karl Anthony Towns had last year to kind of occupy that space. It's the challenge of being so wing dominant is that
But they might, but it would be Al Horford, and then that's kind of really limits their offensive options.
Exactly.
I got a few special predictions here.
Okay.
Here's one, and man, it's really tough to see how this is going to come from, but just based on history, the top 8 that we think in the East, as obvious as it seems to us right now, I predict that will not be the top 8 for the regular season. One of these teams, Miami, Orlando, Indiana, Milwaukee, New York, Philly, Cleveland, Boston, will be surpassed by Atlanta, Toronto, Charlotte. Probably not Chicago, probably not Detroit, but like, it's just something that's just the nature of things. Like, the league is just not that predictable, even though it seems so obvious.
It could be health. It could be players taking a step forward. It could be a number of things. And I mean, you can even harken back to Memphis last year, which we knew some of it going in, but like, things happen. Seasons get derailed.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can see more of one of those top 8 teams being bad than one of those bottom 7 being good. I see much more of that first aspect than the second. But like, all right, you tell me Atlanta can't get to like 42 wins and Miami will like suffer some injuries and be at 41. Like, it could easily happen.
Absolutely.
Even though I'm predicting an 8-win difference between the 8th and the 9th seed.
Yeah. As a point of reference, the Hawks did have the differential of a 44.6 win team 2 years ago. So it's certainly possible.
Yeah. Another prediction, even though I don't have Denver making the finals, this is actually what I was thinking of when I remembered Denver. I do think that Denver might have the best chance of any individual team of winning the championship outside of the Celtics, just because I think they have the best chance of beating the Celtics in the finals.
I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
because we don't have the same doubts with them that we do like the Thunder. Like, Thunder versus Celtics is a more challenging matchup. Like, we kind of have we have more of an idea of how Denver can win. Not saying they will.
Well, and the thing that is sticking out to me too is just, man, if we could just have most of these teams be healthy in the playoffs, like, what a fucking unbelievable playoffs this is going to be. I mean, we were robbed of it last year. Playoffs in 23 wasn't really any good. We've gone through it before, John and I, of like, how many great playoff series have there really been in the last 5 years or so, because so many of them just get ruined by injuries. So I think this could be a year, especially those 4 teams we're talking about in the East, 3 teams, I guess, New York, Philly, Milwaukee. I mean, those could all be really interesting playoff teams if they can just make it through the regular season and a couple of rounds of playoffs healthy. But sadly, recent history indicates that will not be the case. One last special prediction. This top 4 in the West will not be the top 4 in the West as well. One of those teams below them is going to break into it. I think even I might, as much as I was kind of lower on Memphis, I might actually give them the best chance of breaking into that top 4. Because I don't really see a ceiling for Phoenix that much due to their defense and possible health to be, a 55-win team. And what do you think of that? Of the teams that are not in that top 4, who has the best chance of getting to, like, mid-50s in wins?
Memphis, there is a scenario for it to be New Orleans, but they haven't done their roster changes yet that would be necessary, and those are so hard to do in season. So, like, there is an alternate Bizarro Pelicans that could be that good. This is not that team.
All right, so what is your list then of championship contenders? Where basically how I define it as a championship contender is, if you told me after the season that this team won, I wouldn't be shocked by it.
Okay, so I would actually have all of the top 4 in the West
Yeah.
because there are ways, even though I have misgivings about some of them, they have the ceiling for it. And there's some that are more likely than others. In the East, I would say that group for me is Boston, Milwaukee, and Philly. So Cleveland, who I have as the 3rd seed, I would be shocked if they won. I think they have some structural flaws. And then with the Knicks, it's 2 things. One, they're so top heavy in health. And the other is I'm not completely sold on them being able to defend and potentially score on the best teams in the league. I think they'll be very good, but I wonder if they'll be that kind of team, which is part of why I had my issues with the Mikal Bridges trade in the first place.
Yeah, that the Bridges trade I understood because like I said, Jalen Brunson is good enough that you take this team to its logical conclusion around him. And I think they're going to be, if you can put yourself in a position to be a top 4 seed in a conference for a 3 or 4 year run, I think you do that. And there wasn't, given the age of Brunson, there wasn't really another move to make. But we don't need to relitigate that. I mean, the Towns trade, I was not as on board with. But we'll see. Maybe if Karl Anthony Towns, I mean, he's going to have as much pressure on him as any player in the league this year, more really on the defensive end. If he can be adequate defensively. But I think like the Knicks to me just have a few too many scabs to pick at in the playoffs. And I just don't think that Towns is so devastating as an offensive player because there's kind of like a formula to deal with him. Like you just put your 4-man on him. You hide your center out somewhere. I don't think you're just like, oh man, if we have to put our center on OG Anunoby, we're completely fucked. Like I don't think anyone is going to see it that way. So and then I think between Brunson and Towns, I don't know if Brunson can produce at like the level that he managed through most of that Philly series through an entire 3-4 rounds of the playoffs. Like he's gotten better for a year. I'm not saying it's impossible. He did also have this broken hand that kind of limited his offseason. So yeah, the Knicks have a one of the best starting 5s in terms of how talented it is that you can recall. But the fit of those guys, the depth, inability to add other players, health concerns, and then also like their best player is not one of the top 5 best players in the league. So I think I mean, would I be shocked that it was Jalen Brunson?
I would be
leading a team to it. Yeah,
Jalen
I mean,
Jalen Brunson would be the worst best player on a title team since
Jason Tatum.
I think Tatum.
No, I think Tatum's better than him. But no, I mean, I think we'll put it this way: if the Knicks made it through to win the championship without significant injuries aiding them along, like Bucks 2021 style, that would shock me if they like straight up beat, like a Denver or something like that. Like that would really surprise me. Or if they beat Boston at full strength. But, sometimes the vagaries of health. I mean, this feels like a very wide open year to me. Are you ready to do some individual awards here?
Let's do it. I will note at the outset that for almost everything we're going to talk about moving forward, these are not predictions on who will win. We're like who will be the winner at the end of the year. It's who we think will deserve it. And so I think that's a more fair criteria for us. There are some exceptions, and we'll get to that because they kind of have to be factual. But the idea that we're not predicting voter behavior, because predicting voter fatigue and yay points for 6th man of the year and all that stuff, that's honestly, I find that a lot less intellectually fun.
No, I completely agree with you. Trying to figure out although I think generally the voters have gotten a lot better than in the past. But yeah, trying to just like, oh, well, what's the narrative and how are people going to be fooled by this narrative and to think that this guy's better? Yeah, that sounds pretty miserable to try to figure out. So let's give me your MVP, Danny.
Nikola Jokic. I'm going to pick him until the wheels fall off. Like he's been the most valuable offensive player of the league. He's capable defensively, and there are guys who could surpass him. I mean, I would say per minute, Joel Embiid did it last year, but you're demanding that they stay healthy. You're demanding all these circumstances. So, as I said, Jokic until the wheels fall off.
Yep, I think so. He was my pick last year. He's been my regular season MVP pick, I think 4 years in a row now, I want to say. And even the year that Joel won it.
So I want to ask you a kind of a criteria
Jokic
question.
kind of took his foot off the gas. So I think I would go with Nikola Jokic as well. And part of the reason for that is I think Luka and Shea are his biggest competition again, but I think he has a better health record than those guys do. So that's a big reason to rely on him. And I also think he still is better than those guys too, particularly as a regular season player.
I brought up before how we do the crystal ball, and I think that this is relevant. I like to think of these more in terms of like most likely winner rather than number two is the guy who's most likely to finish in second or something like that. And that leads to an interesting question. Do you think, because we're dealing with, to an extent, outlier-ish outcomes, do you think Shea or Luca is a more likely number one MVP?
Luka. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that people just like, there's just something about Shea that people just like kind of, they just don't understand how he's doing it. They don't really get that how valuable his defense is. Like I would probably say I think Luka's a better overall player than Shea. I had Shea firmly above Luka in MVP a year ago as my number two. So, but I would probably say Luka, particularly because OKC I think is going to be viewed as more of this ensemble cast, this like loaded team. So I think just for myself too, I probably would have Luka number two, Shea three, and then Giannis four. Like that seems like a pretty obvious top four, same top four as last year. And then Jason Tatum obviously gets the honorary fifth slot in MVP because that's just that's just what he gets every year, even though he doesn't ever have a chance of actually winning the award.
So I actually put Joel Embiid fourth on the logic of if he stayed healthy, I think he has a chance to do it. But it's just, can that actually happen? We'll have to actually see.
All right, let's see here. This is the other question I had for you. Outside of that top four guys, who is the most likely MVP winner?
I think it's Joel. I think that we're
Yeah,
not going to
but
see
he's just not going to play in it. Like, there's no way he's not going to make the 65 games. I would have said that too.
But let's see. So if we and I think it's fair. So I'm still going to log that, but I feel like it might be somebody kind of coming out of the woodwork. But I don't know.
All right, here, let me throw some names out here at you. Anthony Davis.
I don't think he does enough offensively.
No. I mean, and this is, recall here, again, this is someone that we think will deserve it.
Yeah, well, I'll throw a wild one out to you because I considered putting him on this. Tyrese Halliburton. If he's the most valuable offensive player in the league.
That is a good one. I mean, he certainly was in the top group for me. I probably the first couple months of the season, I would have had him top three. So, yeah.
All him, right. I just don't quite see Anthony Edwards being that guy. I don't think that Steph or LeBron have that in them to be that player enough games of the year. Brunson is fascinating, but I mean, it's such
maybe the Knicks are just like blow you away as the number one offense. But yeah, Devin Booker could be maybe one that could just fly in out of nowhere, or actually the other one too would be Anthony Edwards. That's the other one where maybe he just takes such a huge leap. But it's which is going to sound funny because
there's a part of me that just wants to say screw it and say Wembanyama, but it's not time yet.
Yeah. Who will get MVP? Luke, I predict that it will be Luka Doncic. I think they'll just be the voter fatigue with Jokic.
I'll be a little bit more nuanced here. I think that if Denver finishes with a better record than Dallas, that Jokic will still win it because I think that it'll be hard. Yeah. Like if Dallas finishes with a 3 seed in their own conference, I think it'll be hard for voters to give it to him. So I'm going to go Jokic. And also it's I mean, he's been the kind of voter fatigue angle is fair with Jokic, but also there's an argument that the year he lost it, he should have won it. So you kind of have that one that you owe him still.
So let's see here. Coach of the year. this is always completely impossible. I have like 15 candidates written down.
I mean,
Um,
when we're picking it for deserve. So I mean, usually what this is who do you think are the best coaches? So my top four was Spoelstra, Budenholzer, Missoula, and Tom Thibodeau. And I don't. That's not necessarily saying Tibbs is the fourth best coach in the league, but he also has a hard job to do. And like, if it goes well, it will like figuring out their defense in particular is going to be really impressive because I mean, Towns not being a center is something that Tom Thibodeau knows better than almost anybody. But Spo and Budenholzer and Missoula, I mean, I think they've all done fabulous jobs. I mean, Budenholzer wasn't in the league last year, but we have enough of a track record there.
Yeah, I mean, a few I wanted to highlight. Mark Daignault, obviously.
Sure.
I have him as one of the best coaches. But in terms of just like how some scenarios could emerge as just like, because this is who added the most value towards winning regular season basketball games this season. I do think Missoula is up there. Like, we'll see how well Missoula ball translates. This might be kind of the ultimate test of that if they are going to be kind of in more of a resting type of mentality this year. Kenny Atkinson is someone who, maybe the Cavs break out and get the number one seed. Like, you could easily see it being him. Doc Rivers, honestly, like, he's been a very good regular season coach in the past with teams that are a little bit thin. And same thing with Nick Nurse. If the Pacers take a big step forward, Rick Carlisle could be in this. Hey, if the Hornets actually, contend for the play-in, Charles Lee could be a candidate. I don't think he wins it. You could see Ty Lue if the Clippers are anywhere near 500, or Taylor Jenkins. I think like the Rockets could really surprise with Ime Udoka as well. Shit, even the Pistons could surprise with JB Bickerstaff. JJ Redick, will certainly get plenty of attention if the Lakers do well. So, I mean, there's just so many guys out there. Jamal Mosley was like right in coach of the year last year. Like I said, the coaching profession is just in a great place. We didn't even mention Chris Finch, who was up at the top last year. So there really are, I think, like 15 guys who could plausibly win this award. There are fewer. So my top three, though, was Joe Mazzulla, Mark Daignault, and Mike Budenholzer. And then first coach to be fired, I only had really 5 candidates that I could see it even being plausible in season. Really only 4 maybe plausible.
I had 4, so I'll be interested in who you have.
All right, well, who are your 4?
I'll briefly preface this. So this is one that isn't deserves. This is one where it's just we're predicting what actually happens. And so it is the key thing that you're looking for here. I like to think of it as a front office that sees their team differently than we do. And like if in the idea that we're right. And so my number 1 is Chauncey Billups. And that is not because the Blazers are good. It's because they've done certain things over the last 12 months that make you think that maybe it's from an ownership level that they want to be better. I don't think they are. I just picked them to finish last in the Western Conference. And so they don't have that many other things to blame. And so then the other 3 are kind of in line with that.
Yeah,
like
he's also, this is what, year 4 for him already? And I think this is the last guaranteed year of his contract. He signed a 5-year deal, and I would imagine it's the usual team option on the last year structure.
Right. And so that could be, we want a little bolt. The young players aren't listening to him, all that type of stuff. And so I think that there's an argument there. And then the other 3 that I have are, I don't think they're that good, but maybe ownership / management does. And that's Willie Green with the Pelicans, Ty Lue with the Clippers, and Darko Rajakovic with the Raptors.
Ty Lue?
Yeah.
Didn't he just sign an extension?
Oh, you're right, he did.
I guess thinking it was at the start of last year.
But I was thinking if they needed to blame somebody, but maybe they don't.
No, I don't think they do. I mean, they'll want to keep it. I could see it more being him at the end of the year, just being like, "Hey, guys,
yeah," and we don't count mutual
right?
conscious mutual uncouplings as firings. So who are the others that you wanted to talk about?
Well, all right. So Billups, Rajakovic, Willie Green. Did you say Willie Green?
I did.
Yeah. I mean, that's
my number
2 where, Taylor Jenkins, I mean, they replaced his entire staff. How much of that was at his behest? How much wasn't? But that's one of these, and Chris Harrington talked about this well on our pod, that he thought you're kind of in the JB Bickerstaff. Well, you can't change the players, or before we change the players, let's change the coach. Maybe that's it. Maybe he just will have lost them emotionally at this point, and they won't have any other buttons to push if things go poorly. And then I don't think that under any circumstances would this be in season, unless they're 500 and have been healthy. But I do think if things don't go well for Denver this year, I think it could be Michael Malone's last year in Denver.
I don't think it happens
of the
in
season
season
thing.
Yeah.
That's more of an end of the season type of thing for me.
The one I want to add in here, even though I think he's a good coach, is Mike Brown. Where if the Kings just think they're
he just extended in the offseason also. Yeah,
this
I remember there was that drama. Yeah,
this is what happens when I travel right around the coach extension season. I miss some of those. But let's go to Defensive Player of the Year, and I think, and you and I have disagreed on this at points in the past, that there is a 3-player conversation here, which there are appropriately 3 spots on the ballot. In my order, it's Victor Wembanyama, Rudy Gobert, Bam Adebayo. I could tolerate an argument for different ordering there, but I don't think that there's anyone outside of those 3, all respect to Chet Holmgren, that is due, that really, really has a big shot of being number 1.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be Gobert this year, just the natural consequence of aging a little bit at 32. I mean, it was really a remarkable historical aberration that he even made it to be Defensive Player of the Year at 31 last year. So I think I still have him third just because I think he has a pretty high floor as a defensive player, and that system should be pretty good. I mean, I don't know if Victor is going to win it because I just think the Spurs are going to be so bad, but I expect there to just be a massive statistical footprint for him. So I could very easily see us picking him. And so he's actually going to be my number 1, although I think there are a lot of great candidates. Bam Adebayo would be my number 2. And who else is kind of on your contenders list there?
So mine is a little bit less robust than yours is there. Because generally Chet Holmgren, he had a very good year last year. Let's see who else. I mean, I would love for Jaren Jackson to be healthy enough, but he's starting the year hurt. That's always a big concern. I'm generally skeptical of perimeter guys. I mean, I think Caruso is an awesome defender, but I don't think that generally speaking.
I think they could maybe be on the bottom end of all defense, but yeah, you just can't be that good as a perimeter player. I mean, I think the Marcus Smart Defensive Player of the Year hasn't aged too well, I would say, in my opinion.
No, it's aged about as poorly as Marcus Smart has, but
yeah, and also Caruso isn't going to play enough minutes either.
True. Outside of, do you think there is anyone big I'm missing?
Giannis has been at that level before. I think he's probably a little too old and is just going to have too much of a load on him. AD, same thing. The lift is just going to be too heavy with their lack of perimeter defensive talent.
Yeah. I think Davis is a good inclusion in our conversation because he does have a chance. Like, he is that good still.
Yeah, and even Joel Embiid is someone who has kind of been on the fringes of what would have been my ballot before, but I think just wearing the knee brace this year and not playing that many games would be hard for him to get out of the top 3. But he certainly has been around the level of a top 3 defensive player in the regular season before. Also, I have a category I like to say of just like breakout candidates on defense of guys who are going to be, can really like get into maybe this conversation. I mean, that probably starts with 2 guys to me, Derek Lively and Evan Mobley. I know Mobley has been top 3 even for you before.
He has.
And then anybody else that I kind of have younger guys that I don't expect to be like truly top 10, but like kind of players to watch. One of those is Donovan Clingan. I think he's going to maybe have, I'm not going to quite say a Jonathan Isaac level of footprint. I don't put Isaac in this category. He's just not going to play enough minutes. But I think he could just have a real impact on some of these Portland bench units. Ryan Dunn, if he can stay on the floor offensively, could be a guy who really breaks out. Someone who I've heard had a really good camp is Yves Misi, who I know is a favorite of yours.
That would be, I mean, that would be a big win for him. But yeah.
And then let's see. I think he's going to get a chance to contribute. Jaden McDaniels, I think, could even get to like another level. I think someone who's just not been talked about at all in Houston with all these other exciting names is Jabari Smith. I thought he was really key to their defense a year ago. And then Peyton Watson in Denver, too, I think could do some really interesting stuff. Sixth man of the year.
You and I love players here who come off the bench but are credible, can credibly close games for their team. And there are a number of guys who at least have the possibility now. Some of them will potentially move into starting lineups or move into closing lineups and not be eligible. That sort of thing can happen due to injuries and everything else. I think of kind of 5 guys at kind of the head of the table. I will acknowledge Al Horford, but because of Porzingis' injuries, I think that he will be ineligible. And because Porzingis is probably going to be managed enough once he is available, that I think Horford will start enough games that he will not be eligible. Those guys for me, in loose order, Derek Lively the third, because it looks like Gafford's going to start.
Third, second. No, Gafford's not going to start. It's going to be Lively.
Okay, you think it's going to be Lively?
Gafford apparently just started that one game. Cato told me this the other day. He just started that one game because they were starting like other bench guys. So they wanted him to just play with those guys. Right. No, Lively is going to
start. Gafford then goes on my list, but I'm moving him back because I like Lively better. The others, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Isaiah Hartenstein, Malik Monk, and depending, I kind of think of it as the 6th Nick. If the 6th Nick, so Josh Hart is the most likely. But if they have injuries, then that person's probably going to start enough to not be eligible. So
yeah. Well, and in practice, it's often a guy who starts just enough to pile up a bunch of numbers and points per game, but not actually start 41 games or half the games that they play. My pick is Dante DiVincenzo. I think he's just.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, he
if he just has if he just has the season he had last year, he would have been the best of those. I don't think he's going to start unless they really move some things around. And then some other guys, Trey Murphy, starting the season injured again, but looks like he will be coming off the bench. Maybe it would be CJ McCollum if they move into the bench. Malik Monk is a perpetual candidate this year, although he may not play as much. Naz Reid won it last year. I actually could see Alex Caruso being moved to the bench and possibly getting into this mix. I could see the same with Marcus Smart, actually, when Vince Williams Jr. comes back. Whichever of DeAnthony Melton or Brandon Pajemski doesn't start could be in it. Now we're kind of getting more into just the guys I wanted to mention as good bench players. Simone Fontecchio is someone who will never get votes, but that I think his plus-minus number is going to be pretty good this year if he doesn't start. I think the Mavs have some candidates with Quentin Grimes, Najee Marshall, or maybe even Klay Thompson if he ends up coming off the bench. Peyton Watson. Ayo Dosunmu is one of the best bench guards. They're going to really, really need his on-ball defense this year with the loss of Caruso. And Sam Hauser is another guy, too. I think is going to have a big year. So, but yeah, my pick is DiVincenzo, number 1, and probably Murphy, number 2. And let's see, who would I do number 3? Got to actually type it on my sheet for posterity here. Probably just go with Bogdan for number 3 because he has been at that level before. So who's your top 3 there?
I'm gonna go Bogdanovic, DiVincenzo. I'm mad at myself that I didn't. Sometimes it's hard to remember these things. And
Yeah, that's a good one. Again, the broken hand might hold him back. All right, this is actually probably the toughest rookie of the year that I have had to try to project. So I'll let you go first.
It's brutal because it's a weird class. We've talked about it at length before. Rookie of the year is always a mix of opportunity and success. And remember that we're doing this on deserves. So the like plays a bunch of minutes and isn't actually good. Like, so I could think of, as much as I like him as a prospect, Bub Carrington is a good example there. Like, I think Bub Carrington is going to play a lot. I don't know that he's going to help the Wizards win basketball games all that much. And with this class, it might even get harder to draw some of these lines, because if nobody's really helping you win, then how are you going to hold that against anybody? But for me, number one, as a mixture of opportunity but also success in the role that it seems like the team is asking him, is Zach Edey. And I think that Memphis, they know how to use a player like him. He's looked good when I've seen him play, both in summer league, when he played a little bit in summer league, and then in the preseason. So I don't feel uber confident in it, but I think that Edie's pathway to success in his first year is cleaner than anyone else.
I completely agree with you on that. I just think that he has a very high floor in terms of the playing time, that he's just not going to be that good. And particularly the way I do it, which is, I'm not just going to base it on minutes per game and counting stats. I want to give a shout out to whoever has the highest value, but generally though, I still am going to default to the guy that I think is the best long-term prospect if it's at all close. And so that's why I'm still going to go with Reed Shepherd, even though his path to playing time is not particularly clean. Even if he's playing 20 minutes a game off the bench, I just think he's going to be the best of these guys. And Zach Edey would be my number two. And I actually think Zachary Risachet looks like he's going to be starting maybe in Atlanta. Yep. And his shot has looked okay. I think he's going to be, a passable player.
I have Risachet as the second most. I have Risachet as the second most likely winner of the award, because I think that he again, pathway type of stuff. I think Shepherd is the best player here, but I wonder what the opportunity is going to be.
Yeah, so Risachet is number 3 for me, and Donovan Clingan is probably going to be up there too. Is it possible that he's actually starting by the end of the year? Like, I think he might. He certainly has the single greatest skill as a rim protector of any one rookie. And I think Sarr could still get into the mix as well, even though he's going to start the year injured a little bit with his calf. Hopefully that doesn't linger too much. Kel'el Ware could be a dark horse as well, and Stephon Castle is going to play. I don't think he's going to be good, but if he's going to play, he'll at least have a chance to prove me wrong. The sophomore of the year will be Victor Wembanyama, unless he gets hurt. Who is your sophomore of the year?
Does Chet Holmgren count?
Yeah, of course he does.
Yeah, because
he was a rookie last year. So
because he's a 30-year contract, but he does that. So he's my number 2.
Yeah, you would think so. And I would say really not a ton of guys that I consider to be in contention there, even for like number 3 at Brandon Miller, Derek Lively, and then Keontae George would be the other one that sticks out to me. But I think we'll see some breakouts from last year's rookie class that we're not expecting.
I sincerely hope so, and I think so. Like there are some jumps that happen in this state, especially with young guards. Sometimes it's from 2 to 3, but I think we'll see some. I'd love for it to be Keontae George. He was one of my favorite rookies last year. We'll go to biggest surprise team, and I will note at the outset that the team that I expect to have.
Are we not doing most improved player?
I think we have biggest surprise player. I kind of think of those as running together. Okay. But if you want to do it. Separately.
No. Go ahead. So, surprise team. What do you think? This is kind of a tough one.
It is a tough one.
I always find it easier to do most disappointing team, but.
Well, so I think that, and again, this is for me. I always try to do this relative to my own expectations. So rather than like the consensus, because first of all, it's hard to evaluate the consensus, and like then it's just like, well, where do I disagree? And I don't know. So I'll acknowledge at first that the team that I expect to have the largest year-to-year improvement is the Memphis Grizzlies, because they only won 27 games last year. And so even if they're in the 50 range, but I don't think they're going to exceed my expectations a lot. I don't feel great about it, but the team that I ended up having kind of top here is the Miami Heat, just on the idea that they've hovered in this range for such a long time, but like I think they could be better. They were snake bit by injuries last year. We didn't actually get to see their team together. So maybe the whole is better than the parts that they've had available. Jimmy Butler's in a version, like kind of had playing for his next contract. He's motivated there. I still think Spo's an amazing coach. So it's always hard to predict like who you're too low on, but that's the one that's kind of stuck out to me. I have a couple others, but I'll let you talk first.
Yeah, this one with biggest surprise team, you're kind of dealing with probabilities here. So there might be some teams where my medium outcome, I picked them, like in Indiana, right? Like they would be on that list for me, even though I only picked them for 47 wins, which might be lower than some have them, but I can very easily foresee a scenario in which they blow past that.
Yeah,
I think Cleveland would probably be on that list for me too, although the Strus injury hurts some, just because I think, most people aren't expecting them to be the 2 seed. That's kind of right around where I have them. Although I expect that race to be very tight, of course. I think like if the Denver Nuggets win the championship, I think a lot of people would be surprised by that. I have them as my second most likely champion. So that certainly like it just seems again like there are certain teams, certain players that are just kind of like being forgotten about. And because like there have been some justifiably negative headlines, but there's still a pretty decent chance things could totally work out fine as far as the loss of KCP. If you just did this podcast before the Minnesota series last year, you'd be like, oh yeah, Denver's the most likely champion in the whole league, probably. Maybe you'd say Boston because they had an easy path, but like I think that their star has just fallen too far right now. Even though I know there are reasons for pessimism, but I think you just like having them sort of like the fourth most likely team to come out of the West or something like that just doesn't make sense to me.
agreed on that front. A couple others that I want to mention. Again, it's like how that could be better than I think they are. San Antonio, maybe their offense is just closer to competence, and that excising the point Sohan and excising the Zach Collins playing the 5 and Wembanyama playing the 4 minutes. Just you make the whole plane out of the better stuff, and they're just better than I think they're going to be. I acknowledge that possibility. This feels like an insane one to mention, but the Brooklyn Nets, just because I've said that they're going to be like incredibly awful. Maybe they're just kind of bad or like medium bad, and so that would actually be there. And then you brought up the Pacers. I'm happy you did. They're another team here. And then the last one, it's funny because I have them as the number one. I have them not only as the number 1 seed in their conference, but as their conference champion. I think there is a very real chance that the Oklahoma City Thunder just run roughshod over this regular season. They have a great coach. They have depth. They have a lot of internal improvement. They got better talent-wise. They're a really, really good team. So, like, if they win, I don't know, 60 plus, 62 plus, I think that would kind of count.
New Orleans is another one for me too. I think they got a lot of variance, but especially
I have New Orleans on both lists.
Exactly right. I mean, they don't have as much depth as they've had in the past, but they have a lot of talent on this team, and maybe it's just that top end talent of Ingram and Zion. Like, let's see what those guys do. Let's see what DeJounte Murray can do now that he's back at point guard as well. And then biggest year-to-year win improvement. We mentioned Memphis. I actually have Detroit and San Antonio on this list just because they're starting from such a low floor. It very likely could happen. Yeah, let's do a biggest surprise player, and then if there are some other most improved candidates, we can throw those in.
Yeah, because as a practicality, we see most improved player often go to somebody who takes that leap from, I mean, Tyrese Maxey's a great example, from like kind of secondary star to something else. And my player who kind of fits that, even though I've loved him the whole time, is Jalen Williams. I think that he has the profile of somebody who can take on a larger role, and he's damn good. And the removal of Josh Giddey from OKC's hierarchy, that opens up some playmaking. And so it's partially he's a good young guy who will get better. And also just that when you some of the pull up threes and some of the other stuff, like I think he can. I think he can do more.
Yeah, he's another guy who I think there's more pressure on him than just about any player in the league this year to be the second best player, second best offensive player on a championship team. Like there's no more messing around in OKC now. There is pressure. They're trying to not have pressure, but there is. And I'm not sure he's quite up to that, even though I think he's, really his I thought he was one of the guys who was most underrated. I think he's like in the 40s somewhere in like ESPN's NBA rank. I think even last year I had him in like the high 20s just because he plays such a valuable position and doesn't really have any weaknesses in his game other than just, pure like wiggle off the dribble as a creator. But yeah, I think that's a great one. I could certainly see him actually winning the award as a third year guy. He was in the discussion last year, although as a second year guy, I wouldn't have picked him. So, I think here's a list of a few guys that just, again, these are guys who just, even if they get back to their established level, I think are going to surprise people. But, it's like, oh, you forgot about this guy. So Trae Young is on that list to me. He's going to be right back to all you can eat. I mean, if the Hawks are a top 10 offense, like it's going to be all him. Zach LaVine, as much as we're down on the contract, like he's looked pretty good at this preseason. Like he's looked like the guy he was 2 years ago, and he was playing hurt a year ago. LaMelo Ball is another guy who, if he just kind of does what he did 2 years ago when he actually made the All-Star team, as kind of an injury replacement, not one of the top 24 players in the league, but Darius Garland is another guy who just getting back to his established level seems like it'll surprise people, but like they've done it pretty recently. So there's sort of that. Oh, and I would say Brandon Ingram is another one of those guys too. The last taste that everyone had in their mouths of him was that he was just falling apart, being guarded by Lou Dort when he had like just come back from this knee injury and wasn't healthy, and also didn't have Zion next to him. Like there's no reason he can't just get back to being what he's been the last couple of years, and that's a pretty damn good player. So.
I'm going to add in. Yeah. I'm going to add in one more player thematically who fits with that, and that's James Harden. He's going to have all you can eat too, and if he can be, I'm not saying Houston James Harden, but the straw that stirs the drink. If he can be the system for the Clippers, and while he's on the floor, they're a pretty capable offense. Like that's significant.
Yeah, I don't think he will do that though. I think he's just too old at this point. I think he's just too.
He is a player who is on both my surprise list and my disappointing list for exactly that reason.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like the guy's 35 and he just doesn't have that same level of wiggle. Like he can pass and he can shoot a step back three, and that's kind of like what his game is at this point.
So another player that I have on this, and it's more just maybe he's better than I think he is, in part because of the opportunity he's going to have, is Christian Brown. Like I think of Christian Brown's limitations a lot, but Jokic makes a lot of players the best versions of themselves. Maybe the drop off between KCP and Christian Brown is not as severe as I think it is, even if that's more of a postseason problem. So I like to think of it this way of like, who could I be wrong about? And so like Christian Brown, a player I could be wrong about.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I usually kind of think of this more as far as like surprising other people, perhaps.
I have a few of those too.
Yeah, and one guy I would put on that list is Jalen Green. I think like everyone's talking about Reed Shepherd. Like this is Jalen Green's fourth year. He did just get extended. Like he had a breakout at the end of last year that could have been fool's gold, or it could be another chance to take a step forward. Julian Strawther actually would be the nugget that I think will most exceed expectations. Scottie Pippen Jr. and Vince Williams Jr., both in Memphis, are guys that I like a lot. I think Walker Kessler struggled a year ago, but I think he's going to have a really nice year. So that's probably my biggest surprise player group. And
I'll throw out another collection, which are guys I really like, and hopefully they can convince other people now too. For me, that list, in part because of the Strus injury, Dean Wade. Like maybe he just actually gets the chance and does it. I mean, he's never really stayed healthy enough to do it. DeAnthony Melton, I think he's a really good player if he can be past this back injury and everything else. Najee Marshall, kind of a similar story. I think he's better than the general perception of him. And then another dunked on deep favorite, Trey Murphy III. I mean, I think Trey is just a really good basketball player, and he fits the versions of the Pelicans that make sense so well. And so if the Pelicans get to a version of themselves that makes sense, I think he will be an important part of it.
All right, in terms of most improved player candidates, here are a few I'll throw out here for you. Andrew Nemhard, you mentioned J-Dub already. If this Bam Adebayo shooting threes thing is real, like if he actually is a threat out there, that would be massive. I actually went on the 5 Reasons Sports Pod today and we talked about that a little bit. But like if he's actually like a legitimate threat out there and is taking like 5 per 36, like he becomes an unbelievably valuable player all of a sudden. Like that could really change things a ton for this Miami Heat offense. Paolo Banchero, so I think I'm higher on him than Franz. You know, I'm not sure how much more spacing they're going to have this year to let him sing, but I think he can cut down on the turnovers some. I mean, Tyrese Maxey, just the track record of improvement every single year is remarkable. Scotty Barnes is another guy who I think, you know, could really take a big step forward this year. I mentioned Kessler. I'm trying to think if there's anyone else that's like really high on that list for me of guys that I expect to really. I think Chet Holmgren actually, you know, not technically a third-year player, but is someone that could look really good there. Jalen Johnson, Jonathan Kuminga, those are guys who are on that most improved list as well for me. You know, I'm not sure whether you would say LaMelo is there just because of the health issues. You know, there's a reason this is not comeback player of the year anymore, though. Not to say that LaMelo is doing the stuff that all the comeback players of the year did back in the 80s. At least not quite the exact same type of stuff. You know, actually, I mean, Josh Giddey could be a guy who gets into this mix. I'm not picking him to do that, but he'll certainly have the opportunity for it. And Evan Mobley, also someone, again, if the shooting improvement happens, he could be in there.
If you upgrade him from like your number 50 power forward to where I have him, then that would be a significant improvement.
My number 50 power. Well,
I'm joking. I'm joking.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
I can't remember where he was, like 10 or something. Anyway, I'm gonna actually pick, and this is always such a ridiculously hard award. I'll probably go. I actually believe in like the Bam shooting. I'm actually going to pick him number 1, hilariously. J-Dub probably number 2, and then give me Paolo at number 3.
I'm taking J-Dub number 1.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe part of that is just like he's kind of underrated last year. Maybe not in your eyes,
but there's also he could get some of the benefits that Shea got last year of this team that has so much spacing and that has all these other good players of like, oh yeah, and it gets more like kind of higher usage because no Giddey. So it could potentially, I think that it might, and yeah, it always is weird to do this because it's how do you reconcile like your own expectations with everybody else's and everything else.
Okay. Biggest or most disappointing team, excuse me.
I will note at the outset that the team that I expect to have the biggest year-to-year drop is the Clippers. They are not on this list for me because I expect them to not be good, and so them not being good would not be a surprise. I like to think of this. I brought up how it's like, you know, that I could be wrong on them. It's more kind of like it is that too, but it's also where I see flaws that are like I don't want to talk about the obvious like health. Like that's not a part of this for me. It's not like, oh, you know, like the Sixers if Joel Embiid isn't unhealthy. And that's why the team for me at the top of this is the Pelicans, who I like their talent. I am worried about how they're going to handle this big wise. And this will tie into a player that I have in my consideration for most disappointing player, figuring out Zion's place in all this. Can he stay healthy and everything else? And so while I like a lot of the Pelicans and I think that they're close to this, I could see this being this that they, because they're starting the season with so many of these dudes still on the team, where it just goes off the rails quite just enough that they just can't kind of square it up this year.
Based on the way I have done my predictions, I think probably the Lakers would be the one for me, even though I'm only like half a win under their over-under. I think most people are kind of thinking it's going to be higher, at least in market. The Clippers, of course, are another one. And I think, you know, New York, Milwaukee, Philly all have some disaster potential with their injuries. Golden State, if Steph misses time, I mean, they're going to be totally screwed offensively. I think, I could see the Lakers and Warriors as being one of the teams with the biggest year-to-year win drop. I mean, even Boston, right? Like they won 64 a year ago. Like if they just fall to 54, that's like a 10-win drop. So
I will note the Clippers won 51 last year, so theirs will probably be more precipitous.
Oh yes, no, you make a good point.
But there's another collection of teams which I like to phrase this as not quite yet. And for me, that list starts with the Orlando Magic and the Houston Rockets, where I like them. I am a believer in them. Both of them had strong elements of the year. The Magic, it was kind of their overall seed. The Rockets, it was the end of their year. And I thought that both benefited from some unusual circumstances. In the Magic's case, it was that weak underbelly of the East last year. And the Rockets' case, it was the end of the year when like teams didn't care and they were kind of on a disjointed roster. I think Ime Udoka is one hell of a coach. And so I'm not saying they're going to be bad, but I'm saying the people who think that last year, or in the Rockets' case, the end of last year, is just the starting point, that they're entering a different world. I think that, we don't know who's going to end the season healthy, but the Tigers are going to be out more than they were last year. And so I think that there will be fewer wins for those teams to get.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these plexiglass principal teams, Indiana, Orlando, Houston, is it the plexiglass principle that applies, or is it that these are young teams that are going to continue to get better? There's those sorts of things often are not entirely linear. Most disappointing player, or
I have a couple more teams I want to mention. I'll echo you on the Knicks and Warriors. I think that they're definitely a possibility here. And then the other two I want to throw out, I don't exactly know where expectations are for them, but the Raptors and the Kings, like the Raptors and Kings just might not quite work. And if that happens, then that will be a disappointment.
All right, so most disappointing players, I think Karl Anthony Towns trying to play center defensively.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it doesn't happen until the playoffs, but I think it's a higher upside play, but I think that's more likely to fail than not. And then, of course, you throw in the financial aspect of his deal going forward. Austin Reeves, I think, is just, they've held on to him. They've refused to include him in trades. There's talk that he has all-star potential. They've kind of cut back on that at least a little bit, but I still question, he's just kind of a guard, but he's not really quite a point guard. He's not really quite a shooting guard. Can they get the three-point volume up? Another one of these teams that's like desperately trying to get the three-point volume up. Not all of these teams are going to succeed at that. Here's one where I like the player. I think he's really good, but maybe the cart is a little before the horse now. And Anthony Edwards, particularly as a night-to-night regular season offensive force.
He is on my list.
And, people who are like, oh yeah, this guy's going to be a top 5 MVP candidate. Sure, we could see it happening, but I still just, can he really create the most efficient shots? I think he's maybe more valuable as a playoff player because he can ramp up the defense and he can create a shot anytime, and just physically he can overwhelm teams. But yeah, night to night as just like the number one offensive option, I don't think his passing or ability to get to the basket is quite at the level that it needs to be yet. Still is going to settle for some difficult shots on occasion, hold the ball a little bit. We'll see if he can kind of continue to smooth out those rust edges, but I think it's going to be more incremental regular season improvement for him, which I think would be a disappointment to some.
I'll throw out another couple. Franz Wagner.
He was on my list too. I'm worried that the jump shot is not going to be from 3-point range, is just not going to get to the level. And now he's got expectations on him of being a max player.
Speaking of expectations, Jonathan Kuminga. I'm wondering what kind of player he will have the chance to be, what player he wants to be, and how those two things fit together on the Warriors or elsewhere. I have some questions there.
Yeah, he will start though.
Yes. Mikal Bridges relative to expectations. I mean, he's a very good player. I liked Mikal Bridges, but maybe the idea that he can automatically go back to what he was with the Suns, maybe not. Maybe he's not. Like, generally speaking, when a guy goes from being an elite defender to being a not elite defender, reducing their offensive role does not bring them back like that. From what I recall, that is not generally the way that story goes. He could be an exception that proves the rule. And the Knicks defense is going to be such a key story this year. I kind of can't pick it number one because it's only on half of the floor. But Victor Wembanyama on offense, I've seen some kind of expectations that like he's going to take this huge leap there. And playing with Chris Paul is going to make things a lot better. He can be more of a dependent guy. If you take the worst 15% of Victor Wembanyama's shot attempts out of his profile, yeah, that would make things better. His turnover, it was crazy last year, all that type of stuff. But I think it's going to, and we saw this in the Olympics too. I think it's going to take him a lot more time and surrounding talent and coaching and all that to be a dominant offensive player. And so I think he's going to be a force. I picked him to be the most likely defensive player of the year for a reason. But the offensive part of this, I mean, the offensively dominant big men that we've seen in the NBA over the last decade all come at it from a very different place than Victor Wembanyama is starting. And so I think that there are some who treat his offensive game as an eventuality. And while I love him, I do not see it that way.
Yeah, I would actually say Chris Paul has a possibility of being pretty disappointing this year. And I would also throw Stephon Castle and Jeremy Sohan in there too. I think just these Spurs support players like are just not going to be, shall we say, worthy.
And it's funny, you mentioned all them. I have Devin Vassell in mind. It's like maybe he's just...
Well, yeah, that could be health related too.
Yeah, like, and part of it for me, I've talked about how this is like, I could be wrong on. I've been high on Vassell for such a long time. Maybe I'm just too high on him. And in that vein, Derek Jones Jr. had a big shooting improvement last year. He is going to play with another great distributor, a player, James Harden, who has been compared, Luka's been compared to him, probably is the better way to say it, for so long. But I could see Jones Jr. really suffering in that transition. And then Paolo Banchero, like the idea of like, is it inevitable or is it possible? Like that, I think Banchero, I think he's going to be good, but is he driving offensive success at that level? And I'll throw out a few other there are two varietals I want to discuss outside of it. One is like veterans who may lose it. And that list to me, Jimmy Butler, Stephen Curry. I mean, I don't think it's going to be KD, maybe KD. And then I like to think of this more in terms of who defies my expectations, but maybe it's defies their teams. And so I like to have a couple of those just to log it because we'll look back at this. Josh Giddey, I think that the Bulls are overhyping what he is. Dyson Daniels to the Hawks. Like, I don't know exactly what they think he is.
Yeah, if he's going to start and like they are expecting him to shoot next to Trae Young,
exactly.
We'll see on that one.
And then Brandon Podziemski, the idea that he was functionally untradeable. I think, and this will come up in executive and not executive of the year, I think that might not age super well. As like he's a talented guy.
I mean, you don't know. Like guys are untradeable until they're tradable.
Sure.
Until a deal can get close. Like from all the reporting, it's not like they're like, okay, well, we got a deal, but you can't either you put Podziemski in or you don't. You know, like that's all right. If they literally had traded every single thing they could and included Podziemski, they could have got Mark in. But couple other disappointments for me, that Heat backcourt of Rozier and Hero, I'm not that high on. Like they're really relying on those guys. Two guys who are great all defense level of wings or guards, but took massive steps forward as shooters last year were Lou Dort and Jalen Suggs. And
I'm happy you brought them up.
Could be prime for some regression from three, certainly not on the defensive end. Much as it pains me, I haven't seen a ton from Scoot Henderson to think that like this is going to be his breakout year.
Oh, I have a couple. I have a couple in that vein. Dunked on favorites who might not be Shaedon Sharpe and Gabe Vincent. Maybe it's just not. And then
I don't think people are expecting much of Vincent this year after the loss last year.
I think that I still think he can play. And then I forgot on the veterans who kind of slip off Marcus Smart. Like maybe he's just not that guy anymore. And like the idea of, that could be a potential concern. Yeah,
the Raptors paid Kelly Olynyk to be like this really great backup big option. Like he may just be kind of done, particularly if they're expecting him to play center defensively. All right, let's finish up with executive of the year and not executive of the year. My executive of the year, I had go ahead. Sorry,
let's do not. Or let's end. Do you want to end on a positive note, or do you? I know you love not executive of the year.
Yes, well, it's a positive note for us.
Okay, so let's do executive of the year.
So I think there are five guys that really stood out to me. Tim Connolly, Sean Marks, Daryl Morey, Sam Presti, and Nico Harrison. I think Presti is probably your leader right now, just with how much better OKC got without really having to give up anything of consequence to them. Connolly, I just really like that Karl Anthony Towns trade for Minnesota. We'll see whether that works out or not. Leon Rose could be a real positive or a real negative. I tend to think the Karl Anthony Towns trade is a negative. The Bridges thing might be a positive. And their team is just so different than it was. I just like it could really work. It might not, but you can argue that taking risks is what you need to do, and that's what Daryl Morey did, of course, with his cap space. That seems to have paid off as of now. And then Nico Harrison, getting Klay Thompson, getting Quentin Grimes, Najee Marshall to replace Derek Jones Jr. Like that looked pretty good too. So and then Marks just like getting the picks back was I think a really important thing.
And the haul they got for Bridges too. Like so those things all fit together.
Yeah.
Like that's exactly. I have Marks on my list too, and we get deservedly the criticism that we grade teardowns higher than buildups, but part of that is because you can do it well, and I think Sean Marks did. The only person I want to mention, and it's hilarious because I have him on both lists, is David Griffin, because I really like the DeJounte Murray deal for them, but this still being a work in progress. And remember, Executive of the Year doesn't have to just be on the stuff that's already happened. Like future moves will be considered. So I have Morey 1, Presti 2, Marks 3, in part because not only the Paul George thing, but Caleb Martin on the deal that they got him, and being able to assemble more of a capable roster on a team that used max cap space on a free agent is extremely uncommon. And so Presti was great. I thought he did an extremely good job. And I mean, the Giddy for Caruso deal is a heist from their perspective. So I'm fine with having Presti number 1, but Morey's pathway to success is so uncommon in the modern NBA that I think I want to give him credit. And I mean, if the Sixers are good, it's an amazing kind of story of that you can still build a team that way.
Not Executive of the Year. Calvin Booth, I think his circumstances were hamstrung by financial constraints, not entirely of his making, but
there is a part of the job, even if I think that the Kroenkes have done a terrible job owning the Nuggets, that hopefully a good general manager can kind of move things along. Like, I mean, Presti at times did a pretty good job. At times he didn't necessarily. Actually, can I start this with a prediction? Please. I think that either Leon Rose or Tim Connolly will be our actual pick for this at the end of the year, but I do not know which of them it will be.
Interesting. I think Arturas Karnisovas has got to be up there as well.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I need to revise that prediction. I didn't have Arturas on my list. No.
Rob Pelinka, the Lakers doing absolutely nothing this offseason. We'll see what happens, obviously, at the deadline. Trajan Langdon, I did like the pick of Ron Holland. We'll see whether Ausar Thompson even can come back. I mean, I'm starting to be a little worried there. I hope I'm wrong on that. But then, the Tobias Harris thing, just trading away Quentin Grimes, not getting very much for taking on Tim Hardaway. That wasn't too great. The JB Bickerstaff hire, we'll see how that goes. Lawrence Frank as well, but if Kawhi was done, then letting PG go, as it appears Kawhi might be done, it does look different, but also maybe you should have just re-signed him and then traded him. Probably would have had some value.
I want to mention another person, okay. And that's Landry Fields. Fields not only, I think, undersold on DeJounte Murray, but also you and I both think that they took the wrong guy at number 1. And I mean, those are two big decisions for a general manager to have and to potentially get wrong. And we'll see. And I mean, also the kind of where they are from a team building perspective, they never moved Clint Capella, so they kind of stayed in this weird netherworld. I understand the Trae Young situation because it seems like his value around the league was so low that you couldn't do it. You and I had the discussion about basically like maybe you'd only talk about things with the Spurs because of the picks. But I think Fields had a rough offseason.
Yeah, we'll see. And of course, some of these extensions are going to come into play as well. I haven't totally wrapped my head around those yet either. The Spurs, I don't think it's going to matter I don't know if you want to say it's RC Buford or Brian Wright or Pop or whatever with them, but uh, I think if their goal was to actually get better this year, they didn't succeed with that, but they also made another good move to get an asset with the swaps. That I thought the Dillingham deal was a good deal for them. That's another. We didn't even mention that with Tim Conley. That's because that's
well, in part because we're not sure how we feel about Dillingham. Like it's a smart move, but it's only a smart move if the player you do it for ends up being the right one.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I think the Spurs are still going to be pretty bad this year, but maybe that's also a good thing.
Two others I wanted to mention. One, David Griffin, for the reasons I talked about previously. And maybe this is me indexing too much on the Lauri Markkanen non-trade, but Danny Ainge and or Mike Dunleavy, like kind of that. Obviously, the Warriors were only one of the potential bidders, but Danny Ainge, because maybe this was the time to move Lauri Markkanen, and it gets harder. He's incongruous with their timelines and all that type of stuff. And then if the Warriors had a possibility on the table to bring in a real difference maker that wouldn't have gutted their team, they may regret that, especially if Steph has a very good year. Like if he ends up not being one of the most disappointing players in the league and you could have gotten, a credible second best player on a top 6 team in the West, and you just didn't do it because you liked either Kuminga, Podziemski, or your own picks. Like that would be a pretty big mistake.
Yeah, I don't foresee that as particularly likely. I mean, to me, Steph would have to be better than he was last year to even start to think about that conversation, which I don't think, obviously, at his age he's going to be. So, all right, I think we're done here. This was fun. A lot of interesting stuff we just put on paper. We'll have to see how it all plays out. If past history is any guide, not particularly well, but that's why it's fun to do this, so then you can be surprised. That's why you have to figure out what you thought, so then you can decide whether you're surprised and where you went wrong. So that's why this is fun to do. And of course, if you want to get every single one of our episodes, every Hollinger and Duncan, access to our cap sheets, which will be updated shortly with all of these rookie extensions. Those are in your daily emails. Same thing with access to our Discord, also in your daily emails on Dunked On Prime. Use that code preseason2040 at 35% off a year membership. If you're willing to commit to us for that amount of time, we are willing to offer you an awesome deal. Talk to y'all tomorrow when we discuss rookie extensions and the season openers.